Okay, decimal operations video. So in your table of contents, under integer operations, which should be the last thing you have in there, please add decimal operations. And it's going to be on pages 12 through 13. Now I know that I told you to do integer operations on pages 8 through 9, but please go back and change that 9 to an 11 because we're going to add some extra things into our notebook. Okay, once you have that written, go ahead and flip over and make sure you're on page 12. So this is probably the last thing that you have in your notebook on pages 8 and 9, possibly. So make sure, go ahead and number pages 10 and 11 and leave them blank. Now turn over to page 12 and we're going to start our notes there. Okay, first we're doing adding and subtracting decimals. So adding and subtracting decimals should be very easy. Adding and subtracting as we normally would. The key thing is you remember to line up your decimal points. And it's the only operation that you have to line up the decimal points. So we have two examples. Excuse me. We have 45 and 1200ths plus 2 and 6/10. And what I typically do is I go ahead and line up my decimal points first. So notice I have these decimal points. And make sure your decimal points are dark enough to where we can tell that they are actually decimal points. And then I write the numbers in, in the correct place around the decimal points. So once it gets written in, you end up with your problem pretty much looking like this. So there's nothing under that 2. The 6 is actually under the 1. So since there's nothing under the 2, you annex or write in a 0. And I usually dot mine because that tells me it wasn't there to begin with. Okay, and then we're going to add as we normally do. So that's how we end up with 47 and 7200ths. Okay, in our next problem, we have 15 minus 6 and 4/10. Notice 15 is a whole number. There's no decimal point there. But what we should remember is that whole numbers come in front of decimal points. So that means the decimal point would go behind the 15. So now when I line my numbers up, when I write my numbers in, 15 is in front of the decimal point, and the 6 is going to be under the 5, which makes 4 over here by itself. Since there's nothing above the 4, annex a 0. Subtract as you normally would. Final answer is 8 and 6/10. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is multiplying decimals. Okay, when we multiply decimals, you're going to multiply like you normally do whole numbers. But we do not need to line up decimal points. Line up your numbers on the right side. Okay, what a lot of you end up doing is you try to line up your decimal points when multiplying, and then you have to add in all these extra zeros. And that just throws you off. It's totally pointless. You're making it harder on yourself when you do that, actually. The key thing is we count decimal places. So you're going to count your decimal places in your factors. However many decimal places in your factors combined is how many decimal places should be in your product. So in our example, and if I'm going too fast, then pause the video and go ahead and get it written. And that's the good thing about having videos is you can pause, rewind, rewatch. And that's what you should be doing. Every video, especially if it's a concept that you really don't understand, you should be watching it 2, 3, 5, 10 times, however many times it takes, and reviewing. Okay, so we're going to multiply like we normally do. Notice I did not put my decimal points in line and add in the extra 0. That would have been totally pointless because all I would have had is a row of zeros here, which would change absolutely nothing. So when I multiply the 8 times the top number, 3.77, I get 3016. Then I'm going to come and multiply 2 times the top number, and remember to add in your 0 before you start multiplying. Now when we add it all up, we get 10556. Since I have 2 decimal places in my top factor, 1 decimal place in the bottom factor, that means my product should have 3 decimal places. So I will start at the back of the number and count over 3 times. And that's how I know my decimal point goes between the 0 and the 5. So final answer is 10 and 556 thousandths. And if you were asked to round, you would be able to do that. Okay, next thing we're going to do is we're going to use estimation to check to make sure that our answer is reasonable. Because sometimes when y'all do multiplying decimals, you just do some crazy stuff. Since 3 and 77/100ths rounds to 4, 2 and 8/10ths rounds to 3, then our answer should be pretty close to 12. When I look at this 10 in front of the decimal point, then I see that's pretty close to 12. Matter of fact, it's closer than if I would have put the decimal point here and gotten a 1. It's definitely closer if I would have put the decimal point here and gotten 105. So that's how we know that we did that correctly. Okay, the second example, we have 8/10ths times 5/10ths. So all we're really multiplying is the 8 times the 5, which gives us 40. Since there's a total of 2 decimal places, 1 here and 1 here, move your decimal point over 2 times. Since the 0 ends up at the back of the number in a decimal place, we can really drop it off. We don't even really need it anymore. So that gives me a final answer of 0 and 4/10ths. And it's mathematically correct to put this 0 in front of your decimal point when there is no other whole number there. Okay, our last operation is dividing decimals. So we should now be on page 13. Okay, the thing we need to remember is you cannot divide by a decimal number. So key point, your divisor must be a whole number first. If your divisor is not a whole number, then you need to move your decimal point to make the divisor a whole number. So that means you got to move that decimal point to the right, however many times it takes to get it to the end of the number. Whatever you do to the divisor, you've got to do the same exact thing to the dividend. So if you move the divisor's decimal 10 times, you got to move the dividend's decimal 10 times. So that's what this part is saying. Move the decimal point in the dividend the same amount of times. Okay, what if your dividend is a whole number? Well, if there is no decimal point in the dividend because it's a whole number, you've got to add 1 and then move it. So you can't just say, well, no decimal, I don't have to do anything to it. That's wrong. And your answer will be wrong. Okay, and in case you have forgotten which is which, when your numbers are written with this symbol, your dividend is first, your divisor is second. But whenever you set your problems up to divide, your divisor is first, it's the number on the outside, and the dividend is the number on the inside. So you should remember they kind of swap places according to however it's written. All right, let's go ahead and do our examples so we can end this video. Okay, our first example, we're going to do 55 and 318 thousandths divided by 3 and 4/10ths. So when I set this up, 3 and 4/10ths goes on the outside, 55 and 318 thousandths goes on the inside. Now I need to move my decimal point to make my divisor a whole number. And I'm going to do it in a different color so we can really see. So since we have 1 decimal place, I'm going to move this to the right 1 time. Whatever I do to the divisor, I have to do the same thing to the dividend. And don't forget, as soon as you move your decimal point in your dividend, bring it straight up. So technically, the problem that we have that we're going to divide is 34 into 553 and 1800ths. And then you divide like you normally do. So 34 goes into 55 one time. Subtract, and we get 21. Bring down your 3. 34 happens to go into 213. And guys, start using a little number sense. Think, well, you see a 21 pretty much at the front. You know 7 times 3 is 21, but we're going to have to carry something over here, so it can't be 7. It's got to be the 6. So 34 times 6 is 204. Subtract, and we get 13, 9. Bring down your 1. 34 goes into 91 2 times. I have to put my decimal point up there. 2 times 34 is 68. Subtract, and we get 23. Bring down the decimal point. And bring down the 8. And then we're going to divide into 238. And it's actually going to go 7 times evenly, because that's actually what that comes out to be. So final answer, 16 and 2700ths. All right, I'm going to do one last example so that you can see what it would look like if we have a whole number. Okay, so keep in mind, the 1200ths goes on the outside, the 45 goes on the inside. So when I move my decimal point to make my divisor a whole number, it's got to move 2 times. There's no decimal here, so I've got to place the decimal behind the number and then move it 2 times. So basically my decimal point is going to end up down here in the answer. And these spaces are going to have to be filled in with zeros. So technically, I am dividing 12 into 4,500. And then you can do the division from there and get your answer. If you end up with a decimal, then you know that your decimal point should be right back here. Okay, if you have any questions, make sure that you write them down and be prepared to ask whenever you come into class.